The radio crackled once. Then the voice came through. Calm, clipped. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was done debating it with himself. Any unit capable of independent movement, north exit. All others hold position. Sergeant First Class Maren Voss was already running when she heard it. Her boots hit loose shale and she adjusted her stride without thinking. The M2010 rode tight against her back, barrel angled down, retention strap locked across her chest. Smoke was coming in from both ridgelines now, slow gray curtains that smelled of cordite and burning pine and something else she had trained herself not to name. Behind her, deep in the valley, the guns kept going. Not a roar, a rhythm. The kind of rhythm that meant people were still alive and still fighting, and that the situation had not yet crossed from desperate into finished. She ran north. Step 200. Step 280. Step 320. The man ahead of her stumbled on loose rock and she grabbed his collar without breaking stride and held him until his feet found purchase. He steadied. She let go. Step 330. Step 343. She stopped. Not because her legs gave out. Not because a round found her. Not because any order came through the radio she had switched off 3 minutes ago. She stopped because she stopped, the way a clock stops when something essential gives, the way a sentence stops mid-word before the speaker understands why. She stood on the rocky slope with smoke moving past her face, and the northern corridor open ahead of her, and clean mountain air coming down from above. Trees up there. Silence that had nothing dangerous in it. She turned around. The valley was still burning. She checked the magazine on the M2010 without looking down. Her hands knew the motion. 19 rounds. The rifle's weight was precise and familiar. She had carried this weapon 4 years and knew it the way certain men know a voice in a dark room, by feel and pressure and the specific quality of its silence. 19 rounds. She started walking south. Not running, walking, controlled and deliberate, the pace of someone who has completed the arithmetic and the arithmetic said go anyway. 22 hours earlier, the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Whitmore smelled of burned coffee and damp gear, and the particular staleness of a space where too many people had been awake too long making decisions that would matter more than any of them could yet measure. Folding chairs scraped concrete as the officers filed in. Maps covered the plywood board at the front. Someone had drawn elevation lines in red marker across a 12-mile stretch of terrain that looked, from above, like God had crumpled a piece of paper and tried to press it flat with one hand. Maren sat at the far end of the table. She always sat at the far end, not because procedure required it, because from that position she could see every face in the room without turning her head, and faces told her things about situations that maps could not. Colonel Brendan Ochsner stood at the front, 51 years old, the build of a man who had once been in serious physical condition and was still drawing interest on that investment. His voice carried without effort. He had the particular confidence of a senior officer who had made enough correct decisions to trust his own judgment when information was incomplete. That confidence was not arrogance. It was simply confidence, which was a different thing, though the cost of being wrong about which one you were dealing with was identical in either case. Klamath Corridor, he said, tapping the map. 8 miles north to south, narrow in the middle section, opens toward the southern end near the objective. Drone coverage completed at 1400 hours yesterday. Activity assessment came back minimal. Intel rates the threat as low to moderate. Low to moderate. Maren looked at the map. She had been studying it for 3 minutes since it went up, and she had already found the detail turning over in the back of her mind like a stone she could not stop touching. The Eastern Ridge. The drone imagery covered the valley floor and lower slopes in good resolution, standard coverage. But the notation at the bottom right corner of the imagery report read, partial canopy obstruction, eastern ridgeline above 1,900 feet, estimated coverage 73%. 27% of that ridge had not been observed, and that ridge commanded sightlines over the entire northern half of the corridor from positions that would be invisible to anyone on the valley floor. She wrote one line in her notebook. She waited until Ochsner finished the operational overview. Then she asked one question. Has anyone verified the Eastern Ridge manually? Several heads turned. Ochsner looked at her with the patience of a man addressing a concern he had already resolved in his own thinking. Drone covered it. 73%, she said. The coverage notation, canopy obstruction above 1,900 feet, that upper third was not visible. A beat of silence. We will have eyes on both slopes during movement, Ochsner said. If there is activity at elevation, we will identify and respond. She closed her notebook. She had asked what needed to be asked. It had not changed anything, and she had understood before she asked that it would not. But she had asked anyway because the cost of raising a question that turned out to be unnecessary was nothing, and the cost of not raising one that turned out to matter was something she was not willing to calculate. She walked out into the compound after the briefing and found a stretch of concrete wall near the motor pool, away from the overhead lights, and sat down with her back against it. The stars were out. No city glow, no base light to speak of, just the raw mountain dark and thousands of white points pressed into the black above the ridgelines. She pulled out her cleaning kit and began breaking down the M2010, not because it needed cleaning, because her hands needed occupation while her mind worked. The M2010 was built for a specific purpose in a specific kind of world. Bolt action. Winchester Magnum. Effective beyond 1,200 meters under the right conditions. The Schmidt and Bender scope was 0 to 800. She had fired this rifle in heat and altitude and mountain dust, and she knew its personality exactly, how the barrel cooled between shots, how much wind correction was needed when the air shifted from northwest to west at elevation, how the trigger reset felt after a cold chamber shot. The rifle did not hold opinions about coverage percentages or intelligence assessments. It existed entirely in the relationship between muzzle and target, governed by physics, which did not lie. She was still working the bolt assembly when the young soldier appeared around the corner of the motor pool wall. 23 years old, possibly younger, moving with the slightly unfocused energy of a man too wound up for sleep. He sat on a fuel can 10 feet away without registering that the space was taken. Then he saw her and came to attention immediately. "Sorry, Sergeant, I didn't see you." "Sit down." He sat. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his cargo pocket, smoothed it against his knee, and uncapped a ballpoint pen that skipped twice before it caught. "Who are you writing to?" she asked. He hesitated, deciding whether the question was official or something else entirely. "My sister," he said. "She's 14. She doesn't really know what I do out here. I just tell her it's like camping." Maren looked at him once, then back at the rifle parts. "That pen is almost out. Get a fresh one from the supply clerk before we insert. That letter deserves to finish properly." "Yes, Sergeant." "Your name?" "Quarles, Desmond Quarles, Private First Class." She filed it away without comment. She had made it her practice from the beginning of her career to learn the names of the youngest soldiers in any unit she was attached to. Not because she could protect all of them, not because a name was armor, but because knowing a name was the minimum honest thing she could offer before operations began. An acknowledgement that there was a person there, not a position on a roster, and that person had a sister 14 years old who thought what he did out here was like camping. Quarles wrote his letter and she reassembled the M2010, and neither of them spoke again. And the stars stayed out above the mountains, and the night stayed cold. And in 11 hours the world those stars were looking down on was going to be completely different. Neither of them knew it yet. That was not unusual. The gap between what people knew the night before an operation and what they knew by mid-morning was where most of the damage got done. The battalion moved out at 0200. 334 soldiers in a column stretching over a mile from lead scout element to trailing security. The movement was quiet and professional. These were not men who needed reminders about noise discipline or interval spacing. The non-commissioned officers were solid. The lieutenants were capable. Ochsner had built a functional force across 18 months, and it showed in the way the column moved, in corrections that happened without commands, in the small accumulated competence of a unit that had done this kind of work before. Maren moved near the front of the main element, not with the lead scouts. Her job was not to make first contact. Her job was to understand the terrain well enough to see a problem before it became catastrophic, and that required position and elevation, not speed. She watched the slopes. The western ridge rose steeply to her right, pine forest below the rock face, pale and silent in the ambient moonlight. Nothing moving. She watched it anyway because the absence of visible movement and the actual absence of threat were not the same condition. She had learned that distinction in a different valley in a different year, and had never required a second lesson. The eastern ridge was different. Above the tree line it was open rock face and sky. Below the tree line it was shadow. Dense, layered shadow the crescent moon did not significantly reduce. She noted the shadows and the places where the shadow had a slightly different texture than the rock and pine around it, and she filed all of it in the running assessment she maintained without consciously trying to. At the 3-hour mark the point element checked in. Clear, 2 miles into the corridor. At 3 hours and 40 minutes the point element went silent. Not a transmission that got cut, not static, complete silence. One moment Corporal Haynes was sending routine position reports in the clipped shorthand of an experienced scout. The next moment there was nothing. No contact report, no distress signal, no sound of weapons at the head of the column. 6 men, present 1 second and absent the next, as though the valley had simply folded itself around them and closed. Ochsner called a halt. The column stopped. 334 soldiers frozen in the dark corridor between 2 ridgelines. Maren did not wait for a task. She moved to the base of the eastern slope and climbed. The granite was solid and fractured at good intervals. She moved fast and kept her profile behind the rock features rather than against the sky. At 280 feet of elevation she stopped, settled herself against a ledge, and raised the Schmidt and Bender. She swept the valley floor. The column below was a dark stationary line against pale rock. Good spacing, good discipline. She swept the western slope. The shadows read the same as they had at the start of the movement. Then she moved the scope to the eastern ridge. Her breathing paused. Not as a figure of speech. Her diaphragm actually stopped for 2 full seconds while the part of her brain trained to process high-risk visual information sent a signal that overrode everything else. They were everywhere. Not a patrol element, not a screening position. The entire ridgeline from 1,000 feet to the crest was occupied, dug in and camouflaged with cut branches and rock, the result of days of patient preparation rather than hours. She could see the shapes only because she had spent 11 years learning to read terrain the way a reader reads text, by pattern and repetition, and the spaces that did not fit the grammar of the landscape around them. She counted by sector, 20 positions on the upper eastern face, more below. The pattern continued south along the ridge as far as the scope reached. She moved the optic to the western ridge and reread those shadows. Same configuration. She had looked at the western ridge during the approach and found nothing because she had been reading for the wrong pattern. These were not observation posts. They were sustained fire positions. Machine gun placement at the elevated corners. RPG teams nested in the rock formations that provided natural parapets. She moved the scope south. The blocking force was in a dry wash on the valley floor, 200 meters south of the column's current position. They had moved in during the approach, not dug in the way the ridgeline positions were dug in. Assault positions, waiting for the primary fires to fragment and disorient the column before closing from the south. This was not an ambush triggered when the battalion entered the corridor. This had been assembled over days. The drone coverage gap, the routing of the insertion, the timing, the placement of the southern blocking force. These were coordinated decisions made by people who had known the battalion was coming before the battalion had finalized its own plan. She felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She keyed her radio. Voss to actual. Eastern Ridge fully occupied, minimum 200 personnel dug in from 900 feet to the crest. Western Ridge mirrors. Southern corridor blocked, assault element in the wash south of current position. This is a prepared engagement. Multi-day preparation. Over. 4 seconds of silence. Ochsner came back flat and controlled. Copy all, stand by. The first mortar round hit the valley floor 11 seconds later. The sound was not the movie version. It arrived without warning, a concussive pressure that moved through the chest before the ears processed it. And then the secondary detonation of displaced rock and the screaming started and became part of the environment for the rest of the morning. The way wind becomes part of the environment in a storm, constant and present and unceasing. Maren came off the rock face and hit the valley floor moving. Her mind sorted the battlefield by priority. Mortar positions on the eastern face, estimated 1,400 feet elevation. Fixed machine gun fire from 2 separate positions on the western slope, interlocking fields. The southern blocking force had not yet engaged, holding for the fires to do their work first. She found Ochsner behind a granite formation with his radio operator and 2 company commanders and gave him the assessment in 30 seconds. He was already on the brigade net. Quick reaction force helicopters were inbound, 12 minutes. She moved. The battalion spread into the terrain as much as the corridor permitted and fought back with the controlled precision of trained soldiers who had converted their fear into function. Squad leaders were doing their jobs. Platoon leaders were communicating. But the geometry of the engagement had been designed by people who understood exactly how American infantry units responded to contact, and every natural move toward better cover exposed elements to fire from a different angle. The ridgeline positions had been sighted to eliminate dead ground on the valley floor. There was no dead ground. Every meter of valley floor was inside someone's field of fire from above. The first helicopter arrived 42 minutes into the engagement. It was met with anti-aircraft fire that was immediate and coordinated, 2 separate systems working together from positions that had clear angles on any aircraft approach to the corridor. The pilot pulled hard left, deployed flares, and banked away. The second helicopter took the same fire from a different angle and responded identically. Neither aircraft returned. The brigade radio traffic shifted register in a way Maren recognized, from the language of active support to the language of options assessment. The institutional way of saying that the normal responses were no longer available, and the situation had moved into the category where the people holding it would have to hold it with what they already had. She worked the ridgeline positions from below, selecting targets that degraded coordination rather than simply exchanged casualties. An observer team on the upper eastern face at 920 meters, a mortar crew at 1100, a runner moving between two machine gun positions carrying an adjustment order. Each shot bought seconds. She spent them like the last money in a wallet, slowly, and with full knowledge of how many were left. By 1000 hours, the battalion had pulled into a survival perimeter in the northern section of the corridor. Not defensible in any textbook sense. A collection of soldiers behind rocks and in shallow defiles, maintaining enough return fire to prevent the ridgeline positions from advancing, burning through ammunition at a rate with a definite and visible end. The dead were being moved to a central collection point. Moving them was practical, not sentimental. The living needed to stop looking at them long enough to focus on not joining them. Maren moved through the perimeter and found Staff Sergeant Carla Metz working on a casualty near the eastern edge. Metz was exceptional. She had been watching her work for an hour, and the woman wasted nothing. Not a motion, not a second, not an expression. Her hands moved with the fast precision of someone who had converted compassion into technique, because technique was what worked and working was what the situation required. But the supply bags were getting light. Maren could see it in the way Metz's eyes tracked to the bags each time she reached for something, the slight recalibration of a person managing scarce resources. "Hemostatic count," Maren said. Metz kept working. "One full pack and a partial. After that, I am using improvised compression on the lower priority criticals and accepting the outcomes." "How many can walk if they have to?" 7 with assistance, 4 independently, 16 I cannot move without a litter. I need your ambulatory patients ready to move in under an hour." Metz did not ask why. She looked at Maren for 1 second, the look of a person rapidly recalibrating their picture of the situation, and then she nodded once and reached for the next item in her bag. Maren had been in the briefing room when Metz reported the gauze shortage. She remembered the lieutenant's answer. "Requisition it after." After was here now, and there was nothing to requisition, and the people paying the cost of that answer were lying on rocks around her. She moved on. Lieutenant Felix Ruark was 26 years old and had been a platoon leader for 11 months. He was not supposed to be making battalion-level decisions. The executive officer was dead. Both senior company commanders were casualties. Captain Willis had a wound that kept interrupting his consciousness at intervals that made continuous command impossible. That left Ruark. He was standing in the center of the perimeter with a notepad, writing with a pencil. "What are you tracking?" Maren asked. "Positions," he said, not looking up immediately. "Who is where, with what, and how much ammunition they have left. If something happens to me, someone else can read it and know the layout." He looked up. It seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him for 2 seconds. The internal machinery was working hard, running fast to find applicable principles from training that had not specifically covered this scenario. But underneath the effort was something that did not shake. She had met officers who had it and officers who did not, and no training produced it in the ones who started without it. "Ochsner requested withdrawal authorization 20 minutes ago," Ruark said. "Brigade gave conditional approval. The order may come within the hour." She said nothing. "There are 62 people in this perimeter," he said carefully, "who cannot walk out on their own." She looked at him. He held the look. Neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing both true and kind available to say, and silence was more honest than words that were only one of those things. Across the perimeter, behind a boulder, Private First Class Desmond Quarles was sitting with his left leg extended at the angle that legs did not naturally extend. Someone had applied a tourniquet above the knee with good technique. His face was the particular gray-white of a person who had lost significant blood and was running on the body's reserve capacity. But his hands were moving. He had a piece of paper pressed against his knee. He was writing. The pen kept skipping. She had told him to get a new one. The order came at 10:53. Ochsner's voice on the battalion net, clear and without inflection. All elements, this is Colonel Ochsner. Any unit or individual capable of independent movement is authorized to withdraw north. Execute at your own discretion. All remaining elements maintain current positions. Acknowledge. The acknowledgments came back in sequence. Professional voices making professional transmissions. Soldiers processing what the order meant and converting that processing into the only available response. Maren moved north with the withdrawing element. She positioned herself on the highest ground she could quickly access on the western flank and worked the corridor as the column moved, clearing 2 firing positions with good angles on the withdrawal route. The column moved. She moved with it. Cover, shoot, move. The oldest operating principle available. Step 300. Step 320. Step 343. She stopped. The man ahead of her kept walking north. The man behind passed without understanding why she was standing still. The column moved around her like water around a rock, and she stood in it and let it go. 62 people who could not walk. Desmond quarrels with his skipping pen, and his letter to a 14-year-old sister, who thought this was like camping. Carla Metz with 1 pack of hemostatic gauze, and nothing behind the professional mask, but the determination to make it last longer than physics should allow. Felix Ruark with his notepad, holding order together through the sheer force of writing things down. And underneath all of it, 7 years old and permanent Koringal. She had been attached to a 4-man element. The order to pull back came through correct channels at the correct time with tactically sound justification. She had left when she was told to leave. 2 hours later, those 4 men were dead. She had spent 7 years not knowing whether her presence would have changed it. The not knowing had lived beneath everything she had built on top of it, under the precision and the accumulated competence and the professional coldness she had cultivated, because cold was functional and functional was the only thing she reliably knew how to be. Here the numbers were different: 62 people, 19 rounds, 1 rifle. The math said it was not enough. The math said a great many things. She turned around and walked south. Even and controlled, because running was panic and panic was waste. She reached up and switched to a secondary frequency she had identified during the approach movement. Her primary stayed silent. There was nothing to say to Ochsner that would be useful to either of them. The valley opened in front of her, gray with smoke and fractured morning light, and the sound of people still fighting to stay alive, because that was what people did until they could not. She walked into it with 19 rounds, and the clear knowledge that mathematics had never actually been what this was about. Mathematics was what commanders used to explain decisions they had already made for other reasons. She had left once when the mathematics said to leave. She was not going to spend whatever remained of her life wondering about a second time. The first thing she did was climb. Not toward the perimeter. Up the eastern face, higher than she had gone during the initial reconnaissance, past the elevation of the recognized fight zone. She needed a sight line into the upper communication architecture of the ridgeline positions. She needed to read the pattern before she spent a round she could not replace. From 1,500 feet, the geometry of the ridgeline defenses looked different than it had from the valley floor. She could see the layering of positions, and the calculation of the overlapping fields of fire. She could see the communication pattern. Runners moving between positions in brief crouching sprints, carrying information by foot because foot was faster and more secure than radio in this terrain. Those runners were her targets. Not the machine gunners, not the mortar crews, the people carrying targeting information between positions, the nervous system of a coordinated attack. Remove the nervous system and the limbs kept moving but without coordination, without adaptation, without the ability to respond to changes in the target. She watched for 4 minutes, found the pattern, found the first target. A man with a radio pack moving between two elevated positions on the upper eastern slope. He stopped, checked something, pointed. 3 other personnel adjusted their positions in response. She settled the crosshairs. 840 meters. Wind from the northwest at approximately 6 miles per hour, steady. Temperature 8 degrees colder than the valley floor, affecting the ballistic coefficient of the .300 Winchester at this range by a calculable and familiar margin. She made the corrections without conscious enumeration, through internalized physics and accumulated experience. She breathed out. She fired. The radio operator went down. The 3 men around him froze for 3 full seconds before they understood what had happened. In those 3 seconds, the directed fire that operator had been coordinating continued on its last assigned target instead of adjusting to the new one. 3 seconds, 40 meters of movement opportunity for the perimeter below. She was repositioning before the echo left the rock walls. She moved north along the ridge, dropped 15 feet in elevation, found the second communication element. They had heard the shot. They were searching the valley floor and the lower slopes, the logical origin points. Nobody looked at the upper ridge. This was their ground. The assumption of ownership was its own particular blind spot, and she had spent her career exploiting blind spots. She settled behind a flat granite shelf, 920 meters, wind slightly from the south now. She corrected. Breathed out. Fired. 17 rounds. The second communication network node went silent. The adjustment orders for the mortar crews became intermittent. The coordinated pulse of the incoming fire lost 2 more beats, still dangerous, still heavy, but different from what it had been. She moved again, always moving after a shot, because staying was how snipers got found, and getting found redirected attention from the valley floor to the ridge, which was the secondary effect she was producing on purpose. Every asset pointed at finding her was an asset not pointed at 62 people behind rocks below. That was the calculation, not casualty exchange, attention redirection, time purchased in the smallest usable increments. She was 300 feet above the valley on the eastern face, invisible in the morning shadow behind the granite, when she heard the transmission on the secondary frequency. She almost passed over it. The frequency was not one she had been assigned. Then the cadence registered and she stopped. She pressed the receiver to her ear. American English. Clean, unhurried, flat West Coast accent. Not military compression, not a burst transmission. Someone speaking carefully for a receiver who needed to understand clearly. She listened. The loop ran 40 seconds and repeated. She listened 3 times. By the 3rd pass, she understood 2 things with complete certainty. The first was that the 62 people in the perimeter were in danger from a direction nobody inside was currently watching, and the danger would arrive before any other help did if she did not move immediately. The second was that she had 17 rounds and roughly 90 minutes before the situation in the valley became irreversible in a way no number of rounds could address. She started moving south along the ridge faster than she had been moving before. The measured pace was gone. Below her the valley burned. The guns went on. The sound of them had been constant long enough that silence would have felt wrong. In the perimeter on the valley floor, Private First Class Desmond Quarles was still writing his letter to his 14-year-old sister with a pen that kept skipping. He was pressing harder when the ink failed, leaving impressions in the paper. The words were still there even when the ink was not. The shape of them remained. She had told him to get a new pen. She was not going to let that letter stay unfinished. Not this time. The commander did not have a name anyone outside his network would ever use. He had a position. He had a radio. He had 214 fighters distributed across 2 ridgelines in a configuration that had taken 11 days to build, and that he believed was as close to complete as terrain and available resources allowed. He had studied American infantry doctrine for 4 years. He knew how they moved under fire. He knew how battalion commanders made decisions when air support was denied and ammunition was declining, and the brigade was offering authorization to withdraw. He had planned for every phase of it. What his planning had not accounted for was the single figure his northern observation team reported at 11:14. One person, moving south, back into the corridor, back into the valley he had spent 11 days converting into something else entirely. His radio operator relayed the report a second time, as though repetition might make it sensible. The commander looked at the valley floor through his own optic. The smoke was too heavy in the middle section to confirm the sighting directly, but the observation post had a clean line, and the man reporting it was reliable. One person, moving south, deliberate pace, not wounded, not disoriented, walking back in with apparent purpose. He had 2 options: redirect an element to intercept, or wait, watch, and understand what he was dealing with before he spent the resource. He chose to wait. In 11 years of this work, he had learned that the things he could not yet explain were frequently more dangerous than the things he could. The things he understood he could plan against. The things he could not explain required patience before anything else. "Keep the observation post on that figure," he said. "I want to know where it goes." His operator relayed the order. Below, the perimeter was still holding. It would not hold much longer. The mathematics of the situation were entirely in his favor. He believed this completely. He was wrong about one part of it. He would not know that until it was too late to matter. Maren came off the eastern ridgeline at its northern occupied section and moved back down to the valley floor through a narrow draw that the ridgeline positions could not cover from their current placement. The draw was choked with brush, and the footing was poor, but it kept her below the sight lines, and below sight lines was the only geography that mattered. She was thinking about the transmission. 40 seconds, American English, West Coast accent, educated, not military cadence but not civilian either. The content was specific and operational. The loop format meant it was designed to be found by a particular receiver, not intercepted by accident. Someone had put it on that frequency for a purpose. She was not the intended purpose, but she had heard it, and what she had heard changed the next 90 minutes significantly. She pushed it into a corner of her thinking and kept it there. The perimeter first, the transmission second. Sequence mattered. If the perimeter was gone, there was no context in which the transmission mattered at all. She reached the valley floor and moved south through the smoke cover, staying low, using the boulder fields. The guns on the ridgeline were still working, but the pattern had shifted in the 30 minutes since she had taken the 2 communication elements. The coordinated pulse had degraded, not broken, not silenced, running on the last known orders rather than updated ones, like a machine operating from a plan that had not been revised since the first interruption. The machine gun positions were still firing, but on sustained targets instead of adjusting in real time, and sustained fire on fixed targets was substantially less dangerous than coordinated fire on moving ones. She had bought the perimeter time. Not safety, time. There was a difference, and she did not allow herself to confuse the two. She moved to a position on the valley floor that gave her a sight line up the western slope at an angle the ridgeline positions had not accounted for in their original placement, because the original placement was designed to engage a column on the move, not a shooter inside the engagement zone working from an unexpected angle. She settled behind a boulder worn smooth by a creek that no longer existed and looked up the western slope through the Schmidt and Bender. The two western machine gun positions were at approximately 800 feet of elevation. She had identified them during the initial engagement and had not engaged them because from the valley floor during the withdrawal movement she had not had the angle. She had the angle now. She studied the left position for 90 seconds. Two-man crew, gunner and feeder, good cover on three sides, solid platform. They had been working this position for hours with no indication that fire was coming back at them from below, and that confidence was visible in their tempo, steady and systematic, operating a piece of equipment rather than fighting for their lives. She was not going to shoot the gunner. She was going to shoot the feed mechanism cover on the left side of the receiver. At this range and angle, it was a shot requiring patience rather than exceptional marksmanship. It would disable the weapon without producing a casualty, because a dead crew member would be replaced from the reserve elements within 8 minutes based on the response pattern she had been observing. But a disabled weapon required a part swap or equipment exchange that would take between 18 and 30 minutes, depending on what was available in the ridgeline supply cache. 18 minutes was worth more than a casualty count. 910 meters, wind steady from the northwest, she corrected. She breathed out. She fired. The feed mechanism cover separated from the receiver in a way that ended the gun's operational life for the foreseeable future. The crew dove for cover, and she was repositioning before they reappeared. 16 rounds. She moved east along the valley floor, staying low, putting distance between herself and the origin point before any elements could triangulate. The left western position went silent within 2 minutes. The right continued alone, which meant the western face now had a gap in its coverage pattern. She noted it, filed it for later. That gap was going to matter. She found the drainage ditch 40 meters north of the perimeter's outer edge. A natural channel, shallow but consistent, running roughly north to south, deep enough for a person crawling on their elbows to move below the sight lines of the ridgeline positions. She had identified it during the initial insertion, cataloged it automatically the way she cataloged all-terrain features, without knowing which ones would be relevant. This one was relevant. She went in on her elbows and moved south through it. The rock floor tore at her elbows and her knees. She felt warmth on her left arm before she was halfway through and recognized it as blood without needing to look. Superficial. She filed it accordingly and kept moving. 12 minutes, 30 meters from the end, she stopped and listened. Voices, English. One of them was Ruark's. She finished the channel and came up at the base of a granite formation inside the perimeter's southeastern edge. She came up slowly, oriented, waited. She came up the rest of the way and was inside. Ruark was 15 meters away. He heard the movement and came around with his rifle before he registered her face. His finger was outside the trigger guard. Good instinct, well trained. When he recognized her, he lowered the weapon and stood very still. He looked like a man processing information. that had not been included in his list of available outcomes. Carla Metz appeared from the other side of the rock formation, drawn by the movement. She stopped. She looked at Maren. She looked at the blood on Maren's left arm, at the rifle at her face. "You came back," Metz said. "What is your current hemostatic count?" Maren said. Metz held the look for 1 second. Then she answered, "1 pack and a partial. In the last 20 minutes I started using improvised pressure compression on the lower priority criticals." "How many ambulatory without assistance?" 4 independently, 7 with help. "I need all 11 ready to move in 40 minutes. She looked at Ruark. "All of them." Ruark did not ask why she was back. He did not reference the order she had violated. He did not process the situation as anything other than new information changing the operational picture. "Tell me what you need," he said. Across the perimeter behind his boulder, Desmond Quarles had stopped writing. He was looking at her. The letter was still in his left hand. His face was still the gray-white of significant blood loss. But his eyes were different from the last time she had seen them, 20 minutes ago through the scope from the ridge. The difference was not hope exactly. It was something more structural than hope. The recalibration of a person who has accepted one outcome and is now processing information that a different outcome is potentially available. She met his eyes for 1 second. Then she moved on because there was nothing that could be given more than 1 second right now. She pulled the captured radio from her vest and listened to the transmission again. Ruark watched her face. She kept it level. The loop played. She lowered the radio. "How did you get that?" Ruark asked. "Pulled it from a communication element on the upper eastern face." She looked at him. "Someone is broadcasting on this frequency. American, automated loop. The message says the casualty collection point is the primary target for the next coordinated assault, not the perimeter line, the CCP itself." Ruark looked toward the center of the perimeter, where 16 non-ambulatory casualties were positioned behind the available cover. He looked back at her. "When?" "The loop does not give a time. Based on coordination cycles I observed from the ridge, there is roughly 40 minutes between major adjustment efforts. The last significant coordination was approximately 30 minutes ago." She held his eyes. "We have a window. It is not large." Something in his jaw set. 26 years old, running battalion-sized decisions on platoon-sized experience, doing it with a notepad and a pencil, and whatever internal machinery he had been born with that did not yield under pressure. "I will start moving the CCP casualties to the western edge," he said. "Tighter cover, harder to hit with indirect fire. Do it quietly. I do not want the ridgeline to register a reorganization and accelerate their timeline." He was already moving. She went to Metz and gave her the same information in more detail, because Metz needed to know which casualties were being moved where, and in what sequence to manage the movement without creating a gap in treatment coverage. Metz listened without interruption and began issuing instructions to her 2 remaining combat lifesavers in a voice below the ambient noise of the ongoing fire. Then she climbed again. There was a rock formation at the northern edge of the perimeter, 25 feet above the valley floor. From the top of it, she had a sight line to the southeastern section of the eastern ridgeline that she had not been able to access from any previous position. She went up the northern face, keeping the bulk of the formation between herself and the main ridgeline, and settled at the top behind the natural parapet of the summit rocks. She glassed the eastern ridge. The communication pattern had changed since she had taken the 2 radio operators, slower, more cautious. The runners were using different routes, staying lower, working through terrain features she had not been watching when she identified the original pattern. They had adapted, expected. What she was looking for was the replacement structure, because the underlying need for coordination did not disappear when the original means of meeting it was disrupted. It relocated. She found it in 6 minutes. A single relay position on the eastern ridge at approximately 1,200 feet, using a rock shelf formation that jutted from the face and provided both cover and sight lines to multiple subpositions both north and south. All the runner traffic she could observe oriented toward or away from that shelf. It was the new hub. Take the hub and the network degraded again, buying the time she needed for what came next. 1,240 meters. Long shot. Within the M2010's capability at this altitude with this ammunition. Within her capability. But at that range in shifting mountain air, the margin for error was measured in fractions, and the correction needed to be current, not estimated from the last observation. She watched the wind for 90 seconds. She watched the smoke pattern in the upper corridor air. She watched a piece of debris moving along the rock face at approximately 1,100 feet and built the wind model from its behavior with the patience of someone who understood that the time spent watching was the price of the shot being correct. She corrected. She breathed. She fired. 15 rounds. The relay position went silent. The runner traffic below it continued for 3 minutes before the runners apparently realized they had no destination and began holding in their last covered positions. The mortar adjustment orders stopped. The mortars continued firing on their last assigned solution, which targeted the northern edge of the perimeter. But without adjustment, they were working from a fixed solution against a perimeter that had shifted its center of mass southward during the consolidation. The rounds were landing outside the current edge. She climbed back down and found Ruark. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before anything else happens." He looked at her. He understood without being told that this was a different category of information from what they had been exchanging. "Koringal," she said, 2017. I was attached to a 4-man element. The order to pull back came through correct channels at the correct time with sound tactical justification. I left. 2 hours later, those 4 men were dead. Ruark was quiet. "I never knew if staying would have changed it," she said. 7 years of not knowing what staying would have meant. She held his eyes. "I know now. This is what staying means. And I needed someone to know that I know what I am doing, that this is not an error, it is a decision." He looked at her for a moment. "Understood," he said. "Now," she said, "tell me about the contingency relay." His expression shifted slightly. "How did you know about it?" "The shelf formation on the eastern wall, 3 meters above where the drainage channel exits. The mounting bracket is recent. Someone installed hardware there." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. "Brigade-level contingency transceiver," he said. "Installed during the route survey 2 weeks ago. Frequency that runs outside the jamming band they are using. I have not activated it because I have 1 attempt. If I key it and nothing responds, the option is burned." "Activate it." "If it does not work." "Activate it now," she said. "Because if it works, we have an extraction window, and the QRF can route through the northern approach at low altitude using the ridgeline as masking terrain. The anti-aircraft systems are oriented south and east. The northern low-altitude approach has been clear since I took the upper communication network. They will not be able to engage what they cannot see coming." She looked at him directly. "And if it does not work, we are exactly where we were 30 seconds ago, which is a position we are not going to hold much longer regardless of the outcome." He held her eyes. Then he moved toward the eastern wall. She was back on the elevated rock formation when the thing she had been watching for happened. Movement on the southern section of the eastern ridgeline. Not an assault, a repositioning. Elements on the lower slope shifting northward along a route that kept them below the ridgeline crest and below the sight lines of anyone watching from the perimeter. Moving toward the northern section of the valley floor, toward the withdrawal route, toward the only ground exit from the corridor. They were closing the door. If the northern exit was sealed, the extraction had nowhere to land and no route to reach. She had 12 rounds. She had at most 4 minutes before the repositioning element reached the position that would give them control of the northern approach. She ran the problem. 12 rounds against 15 to 20 fighters on a route she had partial visibility on. Stopping them was not a realistic objective. Slowing them was. Slowing them enough to keep the approach open for the time needed was different math than stopping them entirely, and different math was what she had to work with. She looked at the terrain above the repositioning route. The slope above it was steep granite. Approximately 200 meters north of the element's current position, a significant overhang jutted from the face. Not structural. She had noted it during the initial climb as the kind of formation that existed on friction rather than foundation, the kind that did not need much assistance to change its situation. She moved the scope to the base fracture line, where the granite met the ledge below it. She fired 4 rounds into the fracture line at the left anchor point of the overhang. The first 2 went into the rock without visible effect. The third opened a crack she could track through the scope. The fourth went into the crack at an angle that changed the load distribution on the formation in a way that was not immediately catastrophic, but was immediately visible. Rock dust came off the face in a thin curtain. The repositioning element below it stopped. Every one of them looked up at the same moment, the involuntary upward glance of a person who hears the rock above them shift. They pulled back 20 meters and held. It would not hold them long. The overhang might not fall at all. But they did not know that, and the uncertainty was worth more right now than the rounds it had cost. 8 rounds left. From behind her, from the eastern wall of the perimeter, a single transmission burst went out from Ruark's position. Short, compressed, a frequency she did not recognize. 3 seconds of silence. Then a response. She heard the fact of it before she heard the content. A response existed. The relay was functional. Something outside the jamming envelope had received the transmission and answered it. She looked at her watch. 18 minutes. The perimeter had to hold for 18 minutes. She came down off the rock formation and moved through the perimeter. 41 fighters, some of them positioned with wounds that should have taken them off the line but had not. Ruark's notepad had the full accounting. She trusted the notepad because she had watched him write it. She moved along the line and read the situation with the accumulated experience of someone who had been reading similar situations for 11 years, and understood the difference between a position that was holding and a position that was about to stop holding. This one was holding. By the smallest possible margin, it was holding. She found Metz behind the relocated casualty group on the western edge. Ruark made contact, she said. QRF, 18 minutes. The approach is low altitude from the north using the ridgeline for masking. They can reach the northern landing zone without being engaged by the anti-aircraft systems. I need everyone who can move to be ready to reach the northern approach on my signal. Metz looked at her with the expression of a person making a rapid transition between 2 very different versions of the situation. 18 minutes, she said. 18 minutes, Maren confirmed. Tell Quarles. She moved back to the line. Desmond Quarles heard Metz's voice and looked up from the letter. His pen had been out of ink for some time. He had been pressing the ballpoint against the paper anyway, writing by pressure alone, leaving impressions without ink. He looked at the pages, the early words still visible in blue, the later ones as ghost marks, legible if you held the paper at the right angle, which was a different kind of permanent. He folded both sections carefully, put them in his left cargo pocket instead of his right. His right hand came up and pressed against the outside of the pocket once, feeling the shape of the folded paper through the fabric. Then he started looking for a way to use his good leg to help himself move. The next 14 minutes were the kind that compressed and expanded simultaneously, individual seconds long enough to see everything in them clearly, and the total duration somehow arriving before it should have. Maren worked the perimeter line, moving between positions, reading the incoming fire patterns, identifying the moments when coordination was finding new angles. She fired 6 more rounds, and each one went to a specific identified problem. A sniper position on the lower eastern slope that had found an angle into the approach path. 1 round. Gone. A mortar crew that had somehow received an adjustment order from a source she could not immediately identify, which meant there was a communication element she had missed. She spent 2 minutes finding it, and 1 round ending it. A machine gunner on the western slope who had moved his position forward by 30 meters, gaining a sight line into the northwestern corner of the perimeter that had not previously been exposed. 2 rounds left. She looked at her watch. 4 minutes. The sound changed. Not the guns going quiet. Something underneath the guns. A low-frequency vibration she felt first in her sternum and registered consciously a half-second later as the rotary percussion of helicopter blades at low altitude coming in from the north, using the ridgeline as sound masking, arriving below the engagement envelope of the anti-aircraft systems. Multiple aircraft. The ridgeline positions registered it at roughly the same moment. The incoming fire shifted, elements turning attention to the northern approach, and for the first time in 8 hours the pressure on the perimeter line in front of her dropped to a level that felt, in the relative vocabulary of the morning, like the difference between drowning and keeping your head above the surface. Ruark appeared beside her. 3 aircraft, he said, 2 Black Hawks and a little bird running suppression. Little bird goes first to work the ridgeline. Then the Hawks land at the northern edge. 2 loads, possibly 3. Sequence, she said. Ambulatory first. They load and the first Hawk goes. Second wave is assisted ambulatory. Third wave is stretcher cases. It fits on 1 aircraft, she said. She did not know with certainty that this was true. She said it because it needed to be said, and because the alternative was not a useful way to spend the next 4 minutes. The little bird came in fast and low over the northern ridgeline, and the sound of its weapon systems engaging the upper eastern face was the loudest thing she had heard since the mortars started 8 hours ago. The positions she had been watching for hours took fire from above and behind their orientation, from an angle their placement had not accounted for, and for the first time, those positions became defensive rather than offensive. The first Black Hawk settled into the northern approach in a cloud of displaced dust, and Rotor, Wash, and Ruark was already moving his ambulatory group toward it. Maren stayed at the perimeter line. She watched the ridgeline. She watched the gaps in the little bird suppression pattern, the seconds during reorientation when the ridgeline positions had space to operate. She held the 2 remaining rounds and she watched. A muzzle flash on the lower eastern slope at the edge of the little bird's coverage zone. The angle was on the northwestern approach, the route the ambulatory group was moving through. She raised the M2010. 1 round. The muzzle flash went dark. 1 round left. The first Black Hawk lifted with the ambulatory casualties and climbed hard and fast and banked north. The second aircraft was already in the approach. The assisted ambulatory group was moving. Metz had 4 people supporting Desmond Quarles, who had gotten himself upright on one leg by means that involved considerable determination and a partial denial of what his body was telling him, and was moving. Maren watched the ridgeline. The repositioning element she had slowed with the overhang shot had recovered. They were moving again. The northern slope, a ground route to the high ground above the landing zone that the little bird had not covered in its first suppression pass. If they reached that high ground before the second Hawk lifted, they would have a direct firing solution on the aircraft on the ground. 12 rounds would not have stopped them. 1 round could not stop them. But 1 round could change what the lead man's next 3 seconds looked like. She looked at the route, the terrain, the bottleneck 200 meters from their current position where the route narrowed between 2 rock formations, where the element was moving in file and would be stacked close for approximately 8 seconds. She moved the scope to the lead man. He carried a handheld radio on his belt, standard issue for the network she had been disrupting all morning. At 960 meters, the radio was visible through the scope as a rectangle of black against the lighter fabric of his clothing. She made the calculation. A direct hit to the battery pack of a handheld radio at this velocity and caliber produced a small detonation, not lethal at the range of the men behind the lead, but unexpected, contained, and of uncertain origin. In a bottleneck with no visibility, to men who had spent the morning learning that they were being engaged from positions they had not located, the detonation of the lead man's radio in an enclosed rock channel would produce a minimum of 30 to 45 seconds of stopped movement while they processed what had happened and whether there were more of them coming. 45 seconds. The second Black Hawk was 30 seconds from lifting. She fired her last round. The radio detonated. The element in the bottleneck scattered. She was already moving, dropping off the rock formation, the empty rifle still in her hands because it was hers, and she did not leave things that were hers behind without a reason better than inconvenience. The second Black Hawk was lifting when she reached the northern approach. The skids were 2 feet off the ground. 3. She ran the last 20 meters and she jumped and her hands hit the door frame and someone grabbed her wrist and she came through the door and hit the deck plates and the aircraft banked hard and climbed and the valley fell away below the open door. Ruark had her wrist. He let go when she had both feet under her. He sat back against the bulkhead and looked at her. He did not say anything because there was nothing that the situation had not already said more clearly than either of them could manage. She sat against the opposite bulkhead. The M2010 was across her knees. She checked the magazine well out of long habit. Empty. She already knew it was empty. She checked anyway because that was what you did with a rifle you trusted. You verified what you already knew. You did not assume, you confirmed. Through the open door of the Black Hawk, the Klamath corridor was visible below, still burning, the ridgeline still holding the smoke inside the valley the way walls hold water, the shape of the trap still visible in the geography, even after the trap had failed to fully close. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Desmond Quarles sitting on the deck 4 feet away with his left leg extended, tourniquet still in place above the knee, face still gray-white but his eyes fully present and tracking. Both his hands were pressed against his left cargo pocket, feeling the shape of something through the fabric. The letter. He met her eyes. She held them for a moment. Then she looked back out the door at the valley going smaller below them as the aircraft climbed, becoming the size of a scar on the landscape, becoming the size of something that had happened rather than something that was happening. The guns were still going down there. They would go until they stopped, and then there would be a different kind of silence. She knew what that silence sounded like. She had been carrying one version of it for 7 years. She thought she might be able to put some of it down now. Not all. The people who told you that you could put all of it down had not carried enough of it to know its actual weight and composition. But some of it. The parts shaped like not knowing. She was going to know now. She looked at the valley one more time as the ridge rose between them and it disappeared. Then she looked at the deck plates and she breathed. The flight to the forward aid station took 22 minutes. Maren did not speak for any of them. She sat against the bulkhead with the empty M2010 across her knees, and she looked out the open door at the mountain terrain falling away below, and she breathed with the deliberate evenness of a person who has used their body past its reasonable limit and is now doing the slower work of returning from that place. Her left arm had stopped bleeding somewhere between the drainage channel and the landing zone. The abrasions were deep. She noted this the way she noted most physical information, as data relevant to function, nothing more. Desmond Quarles had his eyes closed against the opposite bulkhead. His color was still the gray-white of significant blood loss, but his breathing had steadied into something regular, and his chest rose and fell without the shallow panic quality it had carried in the perimeter. Carla Metz had an IV line into his arm within the first 4 minutes of flight, and was monitoring his pressure with 2 fingers on his wrist and the focused expression of someone running arithmetic only she could see. Felix Ruark sat near the cockpit bulkhead with his notepad in his lap, not writing, just holding it, the way a person holds a thing that got them through something, not because it is still useful, but because letting go of it feels premature. 11 people on this aircraft. 14 on the first Black Hawk. 25 in the air. 25 who had been behind rocks in a valley that the mathematics of the morning had designated for a different outcome. She looked at the peaks passing below, and she thought about the 37 who had not reached either aircraft. She did not perform the arithmetic. She did not subtract or compare or look for the ratio that would make it feel like something other than what it was. She held the number the way you hold a weight that belongs to you, letting it rest against you without trying to put it somewhere else. The forward aid station appeared below, a cluster of prefabricated structures and marked landing pads cut into the mountain slope, and the aircraft descended, and the rotors changed pitch, and the ground came up, and then the solid particular lurch of skids meeting earth, and the door opened, and the medics were already moving. The man was sitting in a plastic chair, outside the third building from the landing pad. Maren saw him 40 minutes after landing, after she had been cleared by the aid station physician, and had her left arm dressed, and had answered the initial accountability questions from the battalion S1 sergeant who was working through a clipboard with the stunned efficiency of a person doing their job in the aftermath of something that had not yet fully registered. She was walking between buildings when she saw him. He was wearing civilian trousers and a field jacket that occupied the specific territory between military issue and obviously civilian, the kind of clothing assembled by someone who understood both worlds and was deliberately neither. He was approximately 40 years old, lean, with the weathered look of a person who had spent years outdoors in places that were not forgiving. He held a cup of coffee in both hands, and he was looking at the mountains rather than at the activity around him. She would have walked past him, except that his left hand had the particular stillness of a person controlling their awareness of being watched. That stillness was something she had learned to read because people who were trying not to be noticed watching were frequently more consequential than people watching openly. She stopped 6 feet from him. He looked at her. He had expected her to stop. That was in the way he looked, no surprise, just the measured acknowledgement of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing, and the specific thing had arrived. "Sergeant Voss," he said, not a question. She said nothing. She looked at him the way she looked at terrain she was about to enter, reading it fully before she committed to a direction. "You were in the corridor," she said. He held her eyes, one breath too. "I left the gap open," he said. "The 80-meter passage through the western ridgeline, the position that should have been filled and was not." She had been carrying that question since the moment she spotted the irregular placement from inside the perimeter. The geometry of the lower western slope had a seam in it that no competent force would leave open, and yet it had been left open, and she had moved 41 people through it, and she had used it without stopping to understand its origin, because the origin did not matter while the people were still alive to use it. Now the origin was in front of her. "Talk," she said. He set the coffee on the ground. He laced his fingers together. He looked at his hands the way a person looks at the instrument of something they are still deciding how to describe. "My name is Harlan Steed," he said. 11 days ago I was positioned in the upper eastern section of the Klamath corridor as part of a documentation operation, not combat, intelligence gathering, observing the construction of the engagement and recording its architecture for analysis." He paused. 3 days before your battalion's insertion date, I intercepted communications that changed what I was looking at." She waited. "The engagement in that corridor was not a standard operation," he said. "The sophistication of its preparation, the precision of its timing relative to your unit's movement plan, indicated prior knowledge. Specific knowledge that required access to planning documents at brigade level or above." He looked up at her directly. "Someone provided them with your battalion's route, insertion time, and order of march before your unit finalized the plan internally." The air between them was very still. "You are telling me someone in our chain leaked the plan," she said. "I am telling you the intelligence pattern is consistent with that conclusion." His voice was even, not defensive, not apologetic, simply precise. "I cannot tell you who. What I can tell you is that by the time I confirmed what I was reading, the jamming envelope was already active. I was inside it. I had no way to transmit out and no way to warn anyone in time." "So you stayed in the corridor?" "I had no exit that would not expose my position to elements that would have acted on that information." He held her gaze. "When I understood that the battalion was going to walk in and the door was going to close and I could not stop it, I did the only thing within my reach. I found the newest addition to the western ridgeline, the position installed last, the one with the crew least familiar with the terrain around it, and I created a reason for that crew to leave for 2 hours." "How?" That brief expression crossed his face again. Not pride. The quiet acknowledgement of an improvisation that had worked past its reasonable probability. "I transmitted on their network using a call sign I had documented 4 days earlier. I reported that their southern resupply route had been compromised and that a verification team was required immediately." He paused. "They pulled the crew. The position sat empty. I could not guarantee that anyone would find the passage or use it in time. I could only guarantee the gap existed." Maren looked at him for a long time. She thought about the 80 meters of open ground on the western face. She thought about Ruark moving 41 people through it in 3 groups while she covered from the high position. She thought about the way she had read the irregular placement and filed it as a planning error on the enemy's part and used it without asking why. It was not a planning error. It was one man with a stolen radio call sign and 11 days of patience making a hole in a wall and then sitting in the dark hoping someone would find it. "The transmission I intercepted," she said, "on the secondary frequency, automated loop, warning about the casualty collection point. Set before the jamming went fully active, he said. If anyone inside the perimeter had a radio on that band and knew to listen, they would receive a warning about the CCP targeting and a bearing to the Western Passage. He looked at her directly. I did not know if anyone would hear it. I did not know if the timing would align. I said it because it was the only other thing I could do from where I was. She thought about the captured radio, the dead communication soldier on the upper ridgeline, the specific sequence that had led her to switch frequencies at the right moment, a chain of small, contingent decisions that had no business producing the outcome they produced. You couldn't have known someone would pick up that radio, she said. No, he said, I could not. She looked at him. He looked at her. Two people standing in the mountain mourning with the full weight of what had happened, and what had almost happened, and what had not happened distributed between them in proportions that neither of them could calculate. The investigation, she said, into the leak. His expression changed, not much, but enough. There will be one, he said. There already is one, at a level that will not be visible to you or to anyone in your battalion. The investigation will find what it finds, and the findings will be classified at a level that prevents their publication. He paused, and this was the pause of a man who has decided to say something that costs him something to say. What I can tell you is that the evidence I documented in 11 days in that corridor points toward a source with authorization to access joint planning documents at the brigade level. The investigation will find a name. The name will be in a file. The file will be sealed. She was quiet. 37 people, she said. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He held the weight of those two words the way they needed to be held. Yes, he said. Because someone wanted data. Because someone made a decision about acceptable risk that was not theirs to make. His voice did not change register, but something underneath it tightened. That is not the same as wanting 37 people dead. It is worse than that in some ways. They were numbers in a calculation to someone who had the authority to run that calculation, and not the standing to do so. The morning air moved through the space between the buildings. She could hear the rotor wash of a departing aircraft somewhere behind the tree line. She looked at the mountains. She thought about Ochsner. She thought about the drone coverage question in the briefing room, the patience in his voice, the certainty of a man who had already resolved the question in his own thinking. She thought about whether that certainty had been genuine or performed. She thought about the difference between a commander who trusted incomplete intelligence and a commander who had been told not to ask about the gap. Ochsner, she said. Steed was quiet for a moment. That was its own kind of answer. I believe Colonel Ochsner became aware after the engagement began that the intelligence he had been given was not simply inadequate, he said carefully. Whether he knew before insertion, and to what degree, is a question the investigation will address. What I can tell you is that he has not spoken to anyone from his chain of command since the extraction. Not informally. Not at all. She looked at Steed. Ochsner had stood in a briefing room and told her the drone covered the eastern ridge. He had said it with the flat confidence of a man who had been told something by someone he trusted, and had accepted it without verification, because the verification was not standard procedure, and the someone was above him, and you did not routinely question things that came from above you in a chain that had always worked before. She did not know if that made him complicit or deceived. She was not sure the difference was as large as it should have been. Thank you for the gap, she said. She walked away. He did not call after her. He picked up the coffee that had gone cold and he looked at the mountains and he stayed in the chair, which was what a person did when they had done everything available to them, and the outcome was now in other hands and sitting, was what was left. The investigation convened 6 days after the battalion returned to Fort Whitmore. Colonel Beaumont from the Judge Advocate General's Corps led it. He was methodical and gave nothing away across the table regardless of what was said to him, which was a professional quality Maren recognized and respected even from the other side of it. He had a team of 4. The room was cleared and secured. She was interviewed on day 2. She answered every question completely and accurately. She described the briefing room, the drone coverage question, Ochsner's response. She described the Eastern Ridgeline observation. She described the decision to return to the perimeter without equivocation or explanation beyond the facts. She described the communication element targeting, the drainage channel, the CCP warning, the relay activation, the extraction sequence. She described Harlan Steed. When she finished, Beaumont looked up from his notes. "You violated a direct order from your commanding officer in a combat environment," he said. "Statement of record, requiring confirmation." "Yes," she said. "Do you understand this creates an actionable violation under the Uniform Code of Military Justice?" "Yes." He wrote something. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has more information than he is authorized to use and is processing the distance between those two things. "Is there anything you wish to add regarding your decision?" She thought about the drainage channel, about the blood on the rocks, about Quarles with his letter and his skipping pen, about Ruark holding the notepad in both hands on the aircraft because letting go felt premature. "The record speaks for itself," she said. Beaumont made a final note and closed the folder. Maren was placed on administrative hold pending outcome. The hearing convened 3 weeks later in a conference room that smelled of cleaning solution and institutional neutrality, the specific atmosphere of spaces where difficult things were converted into paperwork, and the paperwork was then filed somewhere it would not cause problems. 3 officers sat on the panel. The charges were formally stated: failure to comply with a direct order from a superior officer in a combat environment. Felix Ruark testified first. He walked in with the notepad under his arm. He sat down. He answered the preliminary questions steadily. When the panel asked him to describe events in the perimeter during the engagement, he described them accurately and in full, with the particular precision of someone who had written everything down in real time and was working from a record rather than reconstruction. The senior panel officer asked, "In your assessment, would extraction have been possible without Sergeant Voss's actions?" Ruark did not hesitate. "No," he said. "The CCP relocation alone, which she directed based on the intercepted transmission, prevented the loss of all 16 non-ambulatory casualties before the QRF arrived. The passage through the western ridgeline, which she identified and covered, was the only viable extraction route. Without both of those, the aircraft would have had nothing to extract." He paused. 16 people would have died before the helicopters landed. 41 more would have had no route to reach them. The panel noted the answer. Ruark stood to leave. He looked at Maren once as he passed the table. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Carla Metz testified second. She sat down with the economy of movement she brought to everything and answered questions without waste. When she reached the CCP relocation, the senior officer stopped her. "Who ordered that relocation?" "Sergeant Voss." "On what basis?" "She told me she had intercepted an enemy transmission, indicating the collection point was the primary target for the next coordinated assault. She informed me before Lieutenant Ruark, because she needed the movement to begin immediately, and I was closer." Metz's voice did not change register, but something behind the professional surface tightened slightly. She was correct. The position we vacated took indirect fire 11 minutes after the last patient was moved. The officer wrote for a long moment. In your medical assessment, what would the casualty outcome have been if the non-ambulatory patients had remained in that position? Metz looked at the panel directly. None of them would have survived, she said. Given their conditions and the nature of the incoming fire, there would have been no survivable outcomes in that position. The room absorbed that. No one spoke for several seconds longer than the space required. Desmond Quarles testified third. He came in on crutches, left leg in a cast from knee to ankle, moving with the deliberate care of a young man whose body was telling him to slow down and who was declining the suggestion. He sat carefully. He answered the preliminary questions with his eyes level and his voice steady. The senior officer asked him to describe what he had observed during the engagement. Quarles reached into his left cargo pocket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table in front of him without unfolding it. He set his hand flat on top of it. "I was writing this when she came back," he said. "I want the panel to understand something, not as testimony about tactics. I want you to understand what it means when someone comes back." He looked at the three officers across the table. "I had accepted that I was going to die in that valley, not because I had given up, because the numbers said so and I believed the numbers." He pressed his hand against the paper. "She came back and the numbers changed. That is the only way I know to say it. The numbers changed." The senior officer looked at the folded paper. "Who is the letter for?" "My sister," Quarles said. "She is 14. She thought what I do out here was like camping." No one at the table said anything. The senior officer looked at the paper for a long moment. He looked at the two officers beside him. He looked at Maren. He looked back at the paper. He made a long, deliberate note. He set his pen down. He recessed the hearing. When it reconvened, the senior officer read the finding. The language was formal and exact. It acknowledged the violation. It acknowledged the evidentiary record of outcomes produced by actions taken in violation of that order, including the CCP relocation preventing total loss of 16 non-ambulatory personnel, the Western Passage coverage enabling extraction of 41 ambulatory and assisted ambulatory personnel, and the fire suppression sequence that maintained LZ viability for the duration of the QRF extraction. It noted the pending classified investigation into the source of the intelligence failure that had produced the engagement, an investigation whose findings would inform the broader assessment of command decisions made at and above battalion level in the planning and execution phases of the operation. The violation was designated pending review, contingent on the outcome of the parallel investigation. No conviction was entered. No commendation was entered. The file was closed with the particular institutional finality of a system that had encountered something it did not have clean existing language to process, and had responded by not processing it, which was the most honest thing it could do. Maren walked out into the afternoon. Ochsner's office was dark, had been dark for 11 days. His name was still on the door placard because removing it required paperwork, and the paperwork was in the queue behind 17 other things. His resignation had been submitted without a stated reason. People talked. People said he had known something before insertion that he had not acted on. People said he had been told something by someone above him, and had trusted it the way you trusted things that came from above you in a chain that had always worked before. People said the investigation would find a name that was not Ochsner's, and that Ochsner had simply been the layer between that name and the battalion, and that being that layer was its own kind of culpability, even if it was not the kind that appeared in the UCMJ. She did not know which version was true. She thought it was possible all of them were partially true, which was frequently how the most consequential failures worked. Not one person making one catastrophic decision, but several people making several manageable ones, each defensible in isolation, each contributing to something that was not defensible at all when you looked at the full shape of it. 37 names. She held them one at a time. Ruark was waiting by the corner of the building. He still had the notepad. He had stopped carrying it in the weeks after the extraction and had taken it back up sometime in the last few days. She understood why without asking. Some things you put down and pick back up because setting them down permanently required a ceremony you had not yet performed. He handed her the notepad without speaking. She looked at it. The pages from the perimeter were still there. The penciled list, positions, ammunition counts, names, the record of who had been where and what they had to work with, written in the middle of a situation that had no right to produce a record. She handed it back. He held it, he looked at her. "Ochsner is gone," he said, "and whoever gave him the wrong information is somewhere above the level this investigation is going to reach." She looked at the mountains visible beyond the base perimeter. The blue distance of the Klamath Range still on the horizon if you knew which direction to look. Still there, unchanged. The mountains did not register what had happened in them. They held the shape of it in their geography, the corridor, the ridgelines, the drainage channel, the 80-meter gap in a western slope that should have been sealed, but they did not carry it the way the people who had been inside them carried it. "The name in the file will be redacted," she said, "but the rank will not." Ruark looked at her. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because Steed told me the source had authorization to access joint planning documents at brigade level. That narrows the rank significantly." She looked at the mountains. "Someone will find that file eventually. Someone always does." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens to you now?" he said. "I go back to work," she said, "when they decide to let me." She walked toward the parking lot. The afternoon had gone golden, and long shadowed the way October afternoons went in Virginia, the light coming in at the angle that made everything look briefly more significant than it was, and she walked through it without stopping. 6 months later, the hills around Fort Benning had gone fully into their autumn color, and the air had the sharp particular quality she associated with every mountain she had ever worked in, the cold that had weight to it, that pressed against the skin with intent. She parked in the visitor lot 40 minutes early. She turned off the engine. She sat. The flag was going up on the main pole across from the entrance. 2 soldiers working the rope with the care of people who had been trained to understand that this was not decoration, that the object at the top of the pole meant something specific about the people below it and their relationship to each other, and to the thing they had all agreed to be responsible for. She watched it go up. She watched it reach the top and catch the morning wind and extend itself into the shape it was supposed to be. She thought about the 37. One at a time. The way she had thought about them every morning since the extraction, not as a number, not as a statistic in a report that would be classified and filed and accessed only by people with the right clearance level, but as 37 separate persons who had woken up on the morning of the operation with the same assumption everyone woke up with, that the day ahead was one more day in a continuing sequence. She thought about Koringal. She thought about the 4 men. She thought about 7 years of not knowing and about the flight out of the corridor with Ruark's hand on her wrist and the empty M2010 across her knees and the valley shrinking in the open door until it was the size of a scar on the landscape. She had set some of that weight down. Not all of it. The people who told you that you could set all of it down were people who had never carried enough of it to understand its actual composition. But some of it, the specific part that was made of not knowing, the part shaped like a question with no available answer. That part she had set down. She knew now. She had gone back and she had done what she could with what she had, and some people were alive who would not have been alive, and that was not a small thing even if it was not all things. It was not the clean resolution of someone who had won. It was something more complicated and more real than winning. It was the knowledge that, when the moment came, she had not walked away from it, and that knowledge was hers now in a way that the 7 years of not knowing had never been. She looked at the flag. Her phone vibrated on the passenger seat. She did not reach for it immediately. She stayed with what she was in the middle of, giving it the few more seconds it needed to complete itself. Then she picked it up. Unknown number, text message, 4 lines. The first line was a set of coordinates. She looked at them and read the terrain in her mind. Pacific Northwest, mountain corridor if she was reading the elevation data correctly. The kind of terrain that looked familiar. The second line was a date, 8 days out. The third line read, Klamath was not the first. There are 2 confirmed prior engagements. Same construction signature, same intelligence pattern. The fourth line read, ask Ochsner where he went. He has the 3rd location. He is ready to talk. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat. She looked at the flag for a long time. She looked at the mountains on the horizon going full color in the October light. The blue distance of the Virginia hills that were not the Klamath Range and not Coringal, and not any specific place where any specific thing had happened. Just hills, just morning, just the ordinary ongoing fact of the world continuing to be itself regardless of what had been asked of the people moving through it. She turned the phone over. She read the message a 3rd time. She did not answer it. She did not delete it. She put the phone in the center console and she opened the car door and she got out into the cold morning air, and she walked toward the entrance of Fort Benning, because she had an appointment, and appointments were how you structured the days that came after the days that changed everything. One obligation at a time, one requirement, 1 hour. The flag was fully extended at the top of the pole. The wind held it open. Behind her in the center console of the parked car, the phone screen stayed dark. The message stayed undeleted. And somewhere in a direction that coordinates could specify exactly, another corridor waited in another mountain range, and a gap in the intelligence existed that no one had yet found, and the shape of what was coming was already visible to the people who knew how to read the silence before the trap. She knew how to read it. She always had.